see,
so that they can see
the
as
original
well.
line of the arm is there, right here, so that it was a sort of fraction of the proper length, but it was then altered to suggest a long arm to match this one, which would have been out of the picture. This picture has been in known hands since 1783, and therefore...
Well, I'm going to stop you.
Sorry.
Forgive me. But what I would like to ask is that when one thinks of, as one's bound to, I think, in this context, when one talks of Richard III, Sir Laurence Olivier's portrait of him, while that may be absolutely faithful to Shakespeare, is it a true reproduction of what Richard III himself was like?
I think one can say that it stands in the same relationship to the truth as the latest of those portraits does.
But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking glass, I that am rudely stamped, and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph, I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Why, love forswore me in my mother's womb, and for I should not deal in her soft laws, she did corrupt frail nature with some bribe to shrimp mine arm up like a withered shrub, to heap an envious mountain on my back, to shape my legs of an unequal size, to disproportion me in every part, like to a chaos, or an unlicked bare freight that carries no impression like the dam. Why, I, in this weak piping time of peace, have no delight to pass away the time, unless to spy my shadow in the sun, and descant on mine own deformity.
Well, now, that kind of manipulation, and I use the word deliberately, is that also found in some of the written records about Richard III?
Undoubtedly.
Now, very
If
briefly...
these were manipulations, where would they be exhibited? Where would people see them, learn about them? Where would the propaganda effect be achieved? They were all in private collections, were they?
Well, my lord, the chief private collection in question was always the royal collection.
I see.
And the most important of these portraits, the one that was actually altered, was in the royal collection.
Yes, I see.
Well then, I'm going to deal with this without producing any more exhibits, but simply by way of two questions, if I may. Was one of the historians of the period a recorder for the Warwick family called John Rouse,
Yes.
who wrote what is now known by experts in the field as the Rouse Roll.
Two Rouse rolls, in fact.
In the roll,
Yes.
which we can call the York one, that came into existence before the death of Richard III and was made during his reign, are there flattering references to Richard?
Indeed, there is a very extensive quotation. May I give you the words?
No, because I'm going to stop you, I'm afraid. Immediately Richard died on the field at Bosworth. What did Rouse do with that roll?
He had already said goodbye to it. It was, I am convinced, in royal hands. He, I'm sure, made it for the Queen. And he had, though, in his hands a second roll, which was in Latin, and this one he feverishly cut up to turn its coat. And it is that cutting up that is still plain. That one also survives. They are both extant. That one is in the College of Arms. He cut out the first image of Richard with his brother Edward and inserted an Edward III, which was safe.
In modern parlance, I'm going to interrupt, I'm afraid. In modern parlance, is this called editing?
Well, if you use scissors, yes, it is editing.
Thank you.
He doctored it, according to what you're saying.
Indeed.
Lady Wedgwood, I think only this. If we can just summarize your evidence about the portraits and see how relevant they are to the issue which this jury has to understand. It appears that after the event, Richard was made to appear more attractive unattractive rather, than he had been portrayed previously.
Indeed.
And you have shown us that related to the raising or dropping of a shoulder and the narrowing of eyes.
Indeed.
That, with the very greatest of respect, that doesn't really help us to decide whether he killed the princes or not, does it?
I think if you can see that the manipulation of evidence is taken so far that a picture in the royal hands has to go, you might say, to the surgeon, then they are very determined to alter the material.
Yes, but it doesn't, again, with respect, it doesn't really answer my question, does it?
Well,
It doesn't help us, it doesn't help this jury to decide whether or not, at the end of July or beginning of August of 1483, that Richard instructed someone to murder the two boys in the tower.
it is only contemporary evidence of his appearance.
And indeed, what those pictures show, in effect, is this, is it not? That those that were responsible for those alterations might have thought, and genuinely thought, that he was a murderer and a wicked man, and therefore portrayed him in an unattractive way. That's one answer, isn't it?
Indeed.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lady Wedgwood. Miss Sutton, please.
Thank you.
Miss Sutton, I think you're an archivist employed by one of the city companies,
I am.
specialising in the records that you keep in the late 15th century, the period that the jury are particularly concerned with.
That's my personal interest, yes.
A fellow again of the Society of Antiquaries,
Yes.
I think the author jointly of a fairly monumental work, if you'll forgive me so describing it, on the coronation of Richard III.
Yes.
Editor of the Ricardian, which is a publication of the Richard III Society, I think,
Yes.
and has studied the question of the pre-contract. In particular, being familiar with a work which sounds very intimidating from Chicago University, Professor Helmholtz, entitled Marriage Litigation in Medieval England, which is published by the Cambridge University Press in 1975.
Yes.
Now, with your knowledge of the period, of Richard III and of the pre-contract, can I ask you two flat questions? It's been described, this question of the pre-contract, as being simply a pretext used by Richard to seize the throne for himself. Do you agree with that assessment?
No.
It's been described by one of the witnesses, and I hope I have the language right, as a red herring. In fact, do you agree with that?
No, it's the crux of the matter.
Well, it is not known by anybody, despite all the researches, the date upon which Bishop Stillington might have mentioned the question of the pre-contracted marriage of Edward IV to Eleanor Butler.
No, we can only speculate on that.
But upon the basis that it was done as reported in Croyland, that this was a private marriage, clandestine, therefore not celebrated in public, not necessarily celebrated in church, not celebrated particularly importantly, I think, with the publication of bans, would that have been a valid ground for objecting to the validity of the marriage between Edward and Elizabeth Woodville subsequently?
Yes.
And inevitably leading then to the bastardization of the children?
Yes, the two things together.
Two things together. I need not ask you any of the detail about it, save I think this. Was adultery taken very seriously, in fact, in medieval times?
Oh, yes, it was a heinous crime.
When there was a question of succession or inheritance raised?
Yes, undoubtedly.